Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome to today's episode. If you have ever tried reading Allama Iqbal's The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, you know it demands immense intellectual rigor. Today we are focusing entirely on chapter 2, examining how religious experience holds up under philosophical scrutiny. Joining us today to break down this monumental text is a brilliant academic who bridges Eastern and Western thought flawlessly. Joining us today is Dr. Mufti Mudasir Farooqi, a distinguished professor and head of the Department of English at the University of Kashmir. With over 2 decades of experience in advanced academia, Dr. Mudasir is a rare scholar whose expertise seamlessly spans literary theory, Western philosophy, Islamic studies, and classical Persian and Arabic literatures. A former postdoctoral fellow at the Freie University of Berlin, his profound linguistic versatility has allowed him to translate and introduce iconic, complex original works to a global audience, including highly acclaimed translations for Penguin classics. Known for his incredible ability to unpack dense philosophical, hermeneutic, and spiritual texts with effortless clarity, he is the perfect guide to help us dissect the intricate intellectual work of Allama Iqbal. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As we had already communicated that we are going to record 4 podcasts on the book of Allama Iqbal's The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. Actually, we are going to examine, to study and to understand all the chapters which are in the book, but we will try to cover them all in 4 lectures. So today, as per our promise, we are here to discuss and to elaborate and to get something out of Allama Iqbal's second chapter of that very book, The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. Iqbal begins this chapter by addressing a fundamental tension in Islamic intellectual history, the relationship between philosophy and revelation. That's the prophetic notion of the religion. He notes that while Greek philosophy was embraced by Muslim thinkers like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, it was ultimately an alien system. He could not digest that Islam or God needs some reason or logic to prove its existence. He actually stresses altogether on personal relationship with God, what he calls an ego or khudi in his own terminology. So without wasting further time, I will simply start this second episode regarding this book with a question to our esteemed Dr. Saab, whose introduction I have already given in the first part of the video. Sir, Iqbal begins the second lecture, The Philosophical Test of the Revelations of Religious Experience, with an examination of the 3 famous and fundamental proofs for the existence of God. But contrary or to surprise, he actually rejects them, and then he goes on explaining these things with his own arguments. Sir, can you actually tell us something about these 3 basic fundamental principles or arguments in favor of God?
Yeah, you're right that many people find this surprising that Iqbal starts this lecture with discussing these 3 well-known arguments about the existence of God, but ultimately he dismisses them. And these 3 famous proofs, so-called logical proofs of God's existence, are in the same sequence as Iqbal discusses them: the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the ontological argument. Before going into why Iqbal dismisses these arguments, let us first try to understand what these arguments are. What do they say? Because they are very famous and they have been with us for a very long time, ever since ancient Greeks in some form or the other. Now, talking about the first one, cosmological argument, as the word cosmos or cosmological suggests that this argument actually tries to infer the existence of God, to prove the existence of God from the existence of cosmos, from the existence of the universe. And the basic premise of this argument is that everything has to have a cause, and this universe also must have a cause. And when we try to look at what that cause is, we do not find sufficient explanation in this phenomenal or natural world to explain why this universe has come into existence. And therefore, we posit the existence of an uncaused cause. And this is, in a nutshell, what the argument is, that we look at the universe and we see that this must have been created. This must be an effect of a cause. And then when we trace that series of causes and effects, the chain of effects and causes, we reach a point where we have to necessarily think of a cause which is not itself caused by
the first cause or the necessary cause.
Yes. Now I will tell you something about, in the ancient Greece, for example, Aristotle talked about primary mover. which was a variation of this argument that this universe must have started with a primary mover. Although Aristotelian concept of God is very different from the concept of God in theism, in Judaism, Christianity, and in Islam, because there they don't think of God, or they don't conceive of God as a creator who created out of nothing. The idea that became central to theistic religions. But nonetheless, within his own philosophical system, he had to explain how motion must have taken place
at the very first place.
And so he thinks that prime mover must have been there, should be there, in order to explain everything that happened afterwards. This argument was there taken up by some other writers. In the Islamic world, we know Ibn Sina came with the concept of wajib al-wujud, the necessary being, which is also seen as some form of a variation of this cosmological argument, where you actually deduce the existence of a creator or a power from the experience of this world. Then in modern times also, in medieval times, we had Saint Thomas Aquinas, who is very famous five ways of proving the existence of God. And there are also variations of, some of them are variations of this cosmological argument. Now, in a nutshell, the argument says that we have two options. Either we believe in an infinite series of causes and effects, which ultimately leads to the what is called infinite regress, which is not philosophically very satisfactory. Or we have to posit the existence of a cause which itself is uncaused, and this is God, in other words. So this is the cosmological argument. The teleological argument, the second that Iqbal takes up, is the argument from the apparent design in the universe. That it seems that this universe is designed to some end. The inherent purposiveness, you could call it, or you could call it some kind of design that we find in creatures. It seems that this world is made to, for example, to support life. And
what we call even as fine-tuning of the universe.
Yes, fine-tuning of the universe by modern theology.
By modern theologies, yes.
And this design seems to be there in creatures, and it seems to be there in different natural phenomena. And it seems that there is a purpose, there is a mind behind it, who has designed all this in a way so that life actually flourishes, and human beings are part of that larger system.
Yes, even I may add something to it. Enrico Fermi, a famous astrophysicist, he once said that why is the charge of electron exactly equal to that of a proton, or why is mass of a neutron slightly more than that of a proton? If this does not happen, then there will be no atoms and no life will be possible.
Let me add here that, of course, Immanuel Kant is a big name in philosophy, and Iqbal does quote him, and he does take this the idea that these arguments ultimately don't work. He's an inspiration for Iqbal. Immanuel Kant, when he analyzed these three arguments and ultimately dismissed them, he said that the most respectable of these arguments is the argument from design. But ultimately, he did not, he was not convinced that it is strong enough to be accepted as a logical proof of God's existence. No, Kant. And this is the argument that still holds. Many theologians think that this is a
very valid and strong argument.
The third argument is slightly more difficult to comprehend, which Iqbal discusses. It's called the ontological argument. So the first two, the cosmological and the teleological, they are mostly derived from experience. But this ontological is purely rational. It has nothing to do with experience. Therefore,
it has, or even with empirical sciences.
Purely deductive. It's called a purely deductive argument, because it tries to say that we can prove the existence of God from the very idea of God, from the very concept of God.
From the very concept of God.
And how is that? Now, I would like to say something about this, because I find that most people find this very difficult to comprehend. So it proceeds something like this. It says that we can conceive that a being like God can exist. Okay, we can have an idea of God. This argument is actually attributed to Saint Anselm of 11th century, who was an Archbishop of Canterbury, who in one of his writings says that the fool who thinks that there is no God, and then he starts explaining why the fool is wrong. He says that anyone who denies the existence of God can at least have an idea of what God is. But then he moves on to argue that we can prove the existence of God from the very idea of God in this way. We can do it like this. We can say that God, by definition, is the most perfect being, by definition. There can be no more no being which is more perfect than God. By definition, God is the most perfect being. But if, for example, there is a God who exists only in idea and not in reality, then he is less perfect than a God who exists both in idea as well as in reality. So from this he infers that the idea of God pushes us to accept that God exists in reality, because if we do not accept that, then we have to accept that God is not the most perfect being. So this is called the argument from the ontological
argument from pure deduction.
Yes. So these are the three main arguments that Iqbal begins his this second chapter with.
But actually they seem very, impactful and inspiring, even motivating. But why Iqbal dismisses them?
Yes. Now we'll come to that, why Iqbal dismisses these arguments. And there is a lot that Iqbal actually says in just a matter of 2 or 3 pages, where he discusses these arguments. He takes them one by one and he shows their inadequacy and ultimately their failure. And let us begin with the first argument, that is the cosmological argument. Iqbal is here saying that to infer the existence of God, who is infinite, from the existence of the universe, which is finite, is illicit, is illegitimate. That is to say that Iqbal is saying that a finite effect cannot prove an infinite cause. A finite effect cannot prove an infinite cause. And he says that if the effect is finite, then it might very well be the fact that the cause also is finite and not infinite. Secondly, this cosmological argument involves a contradiction. It involves a contradiction because it begins with the premise that every effect has to have a cause. But then when it reaches the last chain, the last step, it abandons this basic premise.
Exactly.
Because it says that now there is
a being with no cause at all.
With no cause at all. So you are actually going back on the very premise from which you started. So this ultimately amounts to a contradiction. Therefore, it really doesn't work according to Iqbal. This is the second reason that Iqbal gives. And the third reason that Iqbal gives is that the cause and effect, they limit each other. They very seriously, because when we are saying that something is an effect of a cause, so there can be no cause without an effect, and there can be no effect without a cause. And to conceive of God in this sense means limiting God, to a great extent. And he further, adds to this that the first cause does not necessarily mean the necessary being. That something is the first cause of something does not mean that that being is a necessary being. And ultimately, he comes to this idea, which is very interesting, which says that this argument actually causes a false infinite. He calls it a false infinite because the argument works in such a way that when it analyzes the finite universe, it takes a leap and then it posits, a being which is infinite. But this leap or this reduction from a finite universe to an infinite infinite God is actually a false infinite. It is not the real infinite, the true infinite. The true infinite, according to Iqbal, is something else, which he will come to later on. So this is something that Iqbal has to say about the cosmological argument. When he comes to the teleological argument, he almost says the same thing that was said by Immanuel Kant, which is that, but he also adds certain things. For example, Iqbal says that teleological argument gives us the notion of a God who works on the universe as if from outside. He works on this like a mechanic, like an engineer is working on a machine from.
That's what they call as absent watchmaker.
Outside.
From
And he says that this is very, very unsatisfactory because the way he studies nature, the way he studies the universe, and the way he wants to argue for the relationship, which is a very important contribution of Iqbal, the way he looks at this whole thing not as a machine but as an organism. That's why we can call Iqbal an organic theist, as against a mechanical theist, one who believes that this universe is more like a machine. So he thinks that this teleological argument thinks that there was a designer who first. Now, there's another thing which is interesting here. When you go back to ancient Greek philosophy, you find that philosophers like Plato and Aristotle also dealt with this problem, but in a different way. Let me give you the example of Plato's Timaeus. Timaeus is a very famous dialogue of Plato. In fact, interestingly, it is the only dialogue of Plato which was known to the Western world throughout Middle Ages. Other dialogues of Plato were lost until they were actually retrieved at a particular point in time. So this Timaeus talks about cosmology, and here Plato talks about the demiurge. Now this demiurge is, we can call this is Plato's concept of God. But this demiurge does not create the universe from nothing. He creates universe from something which is already existing.
Before the existence of universe.
Before the existence of universe, some kind of matter already existed. And the demiurge is that being who actually fashions cosmos out of this chaos. He is not the creator of matter. This fits well into Platonic scheme of things. Because
even I feel this fits to today's physics. That's what the inflation theory also says, that before Big Bang, there was something from which it bubbled out.
So Plato is saying that demiurge did not create matter. Matter was already existing, and demiurge came and he fashioned chaos out of this, cosmos out of this chaos, order out of this disorder. Now I was saying that this fits very well into Platonic scheme of things, because this way Plato is able to explain why there is imperfection in the world without having to attribute that imperfection to the deity. Because if matter pre-exists everything, and in a way is coeval of the demiurge, is not created at least by the demiurge, but what the demiurge can do at best is he can use this matter, which is anyway intractable and unwieldy and difficult to manage, but the demiurge can transform this matter, fashion this matter, and create cosmos out of it, create order out of it. But that does not mean that he will get rid of all imperfections.
Yeah. Or in other words, order will be exactly very perfect.
Yes, it will not be perfect. Imperfection will still
be there.
But at least the demiurge, God, will be absolved of imperfections. And this, you will see, is the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges to theistic religions. If God is perfect, why did he create an imperfect universe with such pain, suffering, imperfections, and all that? Platonists somehow are able to escape this because they do not posit a God who created the universe out of nothing. That is the point. Now, coming to Iqbal's point, now Iqbal has something to learn from this. He says that why would a wise, intelligent, and all-powerful God first create all this and then, as if press it into some kind of service, and try to create some kind of order out of something? In other words, why would he, to begin with, create imperfection? Why does not God, if he has some end to achieve, create something which is already fully fashioned, which is already perfect? Why would he take such a long route? In other words, if you have to reach from point A to point B, you will take the straight line.
Exactly.
Why should you go in a
circular or in some elliptical path,
which will involve so many
difficulties, turns, and all such things, right?
And reach the point. If to reach that point is the end. So he finds this unsatisfactory. What he how he puts it is that why would a wise, perfect, all-powerful God create all this if his end is to reach the particular point and to make it make the universe go into that particular direction? The third is ontological argument, and Iqbal is very clear. He uses Kant. In fact, he quotes Kant there. He says that the mere fact that we can conceive of something does not mean that that thing also exists. In other words, the ontological argument commits the fallacy of taking a jump from idea to existence.
Idea to existence, right?
And he also quotes Kant, who said that if I think that I have, for example, $30 in my pocket, the idea that I have this note in my pocket does not make it a fact that I have these.
Exactly.
People who defend some form of ontological argument say that there is a fundamental difference between the idea of God and everything else.
Imagining other things other than God, right?
But let me put it like this: that even after Hume, after Kant, and after Iqbal, these arguments had not really died out. There are people who still think that they are powerful, although there are many theologians who think that we should accept these arguments, at least teleological argument and cosmological argument, as probabilistic, and not final, and not deductive, and not conclusive. They point to something. They may not be logical proofs of the existence of God, but they do point to the existence of God.
Exactly right. For Iqbal, the Quranic God is not static, logical conclusion, but a living, dynamic reality which acts in history. Therefore, the philosophical test of a religious revelation is not whether it fits Greek logic, but whether it enriches and deepens our understanding of human experience, especially the experience of egohood, the self, khudi. So from this, I have every right to ask you a very third question, which for me is a bit confusing. So after this opening discussion, how does Iqbal move further in this chapter? He takes up the problem of how modern sciences, physics, biology, and psychology provide a ground for this religious faith. Can you shed some light on this, sir?
So what becomes clear to the reader is that Iqbal is marking a departure from a conventional understanding of the relationship between God and the universe. And now in the second part of this lecture, he would talk about how modern science actually helps us reach the same conclusions, which are not antithetical to religion, which Iqbal thinks science can be read and scientific theories can be read in a way which actually give credence to his idea that God is there and the religious experience is a valid experience. How does Iqbal do that? He begins with analysis of different levels of experience, what he calls the level of matter and the level of life and the level of mind or consciousness. The level of matter he discusses, he begins this discussion on physics, on modern physics. And he uses this opportunity to actually criticize the foundations of what he calls the classical physics. And he says that especially the theory of relativity of Albert Einstein has actually challenged the idea of a static universe, which was, which he thinks was something that existed, the idea that universe is a material entity and space is absolute. It came down from ancient Greeks up to the modern times. It was continued in Newtonian physics. But in Einstein's theories, this idea of the absoluteness of space is challenged. And not only that, but also he talks about, he quotes A.N. Whitehead, a very important thinker and what is called the founder of process philosophy, which is also an influence on Iqbal. At least there are parallels between Iqbal's thinking and Whitehead's idea of a universe which is ever growing. Whitehead had said that universe is not something static. It is a structure of events. And the emphasis in Whitehead is on the relationship between these events. And the idea is that universe should be seen more like an organism, more like something which is continuously growing like an organism. There is a creative flow in the universe. And Iqbal finds this very useful. So he uses these theories to attack the idea of materialism. Materialism, which was in a way a kind of assumption of classical physics. And he talks about Zeno's paradox. He talks about other theorists and other writers in order to prove the point, which he thinks is amply demonstrated by new theories, that we can no longer hold on to the idea of a static, fixed, and a material universe. So a better analogy or a better metaphor would be the metaphor of an organism rather than a machine. Then when he goes from physics to biology, he also talks of biology. There he's confronted with a challenge. The challenge is that modern biological theories seem to be pointing to the idea that human intelligence perhaps is a product of thousands of years of evolution.
Combinations and permutations and randomness.
How is human intellect then Iqbal takes this challenge upon himself, and he says that of course he has a philosophical defense of this. He does not have a scientific defense of it. Right. He uses philosophy there, and he dismisses the idea that human intelligence and human consciousness could be merely a product of evolution of thousands of years. And he says that this is something that we have to accept, that although he's not against evolution, just like some other theologians are in totality, but he does point to the problems in accepting that consciousness could be seen as merely a product of thousands of years of evolution. But he also talks about other things. For example, he talks about psychology, and there he uses Bergson. And I was talking about, for example, this Einstein. I want to add something here because this is important. Although Iqbal is a great admirer of Einstein, but he finds the idea of the relativity of time very problematic. And he does not think that that time should be. He thinks that Einstein's theory of relativity reduces time to a dimension of space or somewhat like that. It's a very technical issue.
Yeah, space-time continuum, yes. What they say.
And he thinks that this somehow leads us to accept unreality of time. But Iqbal was a great believer in the reality of time. And that's why he finds Bergson very attractive, because in Bergson's idea, in Bergson's philosophy, there is this idea of time as something real. And Iqbal also, as a Muslim, is interested in showing that the concept of taqdeer has been misunderstood within Islam. He says that it has been misunderstood both within Islam and outside Islam, which is to say that both by Muslims and non-Muslims. What is that idea of taqdeer? That it is something which is already fixed. The future is already fixed. And hence what happens is that it unfolds before us. Just like आपको cassette player करते हैं insert, and it really unfolds because everything has already happened. You just meet it or you see it. He says that is not true. In fact, he tries his best to argue that destiny is not something fixed. It is an open set of probabilities. Time is not something that has, because that will reduce time to a non-entity, to something which is unreal. He thinks that every moment is created afresh. So time is like a line which is being drawn at every moment. It is not an already drawn line.
Well, there can be another philosophical argument against it, since we know that the age of puberty is fixed. We know when the calcium starts reducing from our bones, aging starts. So even actually, as if we are programmed, even it seems as if our life is programmed. So the concept of free will even diminishes there before modern biologists.
1.1, I want to say that despite his admiration for Bergson, he's critical of Bergson also. And the reason that he's critical of Bergson is that for Bergson, elan vital is blind. What Bergson calls the vital, the real time. It is not governed by any purpose, any teleology. And Iqbal says that if you understand teleology in the sense of a fixed future, then of course it is wrong. But purposiveness does not necessarily mean a fixed future. And he defends this position, that purposiveness of anything that goes on, of, for example, time, it is moving towards some realization of something. But that process is something, which is contained within it now. Every moment which exists now cannot be separated from the past, because it's a continuous flow. And it is going into some direction, but that direction is not already fixed. It is as if created at every moment. So Iqbal, because he had a great, he was pained to see that fatalism has taken grip on Muslim imagination. So Khat pe Haat Dari Muntazir Farda ho. That's what he
says exactly.
Yes, in his poetry. That you don't do anything and you attribute everything to your fate, to your destiny. You are the creators of your own fate, of your own fate, of your own destiny. And if destiny is seen as something which is already fixed, then according to him, that does not really serve the right purpose for Muslims.
Exactly.
And then from this, he moves, from physics, from biology, from psychology. The end result of all this argument is that it is not a mechanical universe that we are living in. And the idea of God, when he comes to this idea of God towards the later part of his lecture, he thinks of God as in terms of what he calls the ultimate ego. Now, this is important. Now, I want to say something about this. Why? Because Iqbal is a believer in God as a person. But in what sense? He believes in God as a person. He writes it in this chapter at one place, that it does not mean that we will conceive of God after the image of man. It is said in Bible that God created man
in his own image.
And this was also, famous with Sufis who quoted this narration or this report that in Allah khalaqa Adama ala suratihi. And then they used to discuss what this suratihi means. Does this pronoun refer to God, or does it refer to man? Anyway, Iqbal does not think that God is nothing more like a magnified, non-natural man. But he does insist that God is a person. He calls it the ultimate ego. And in fact, he says that this I, only God can, in the real sense, say that I am. Such is the central position of this I in Iqbal's philosophy. And he thinks that everything proceeds from this I. So God is not name of a mere idea, of a mere principle, of a mere cosmic force. First and foremost, God is an I, is a person, it is a self. And everything flows from that there. So this is something that Iqbal leads us towards the end of his lecture.
Fine. So after listening to all these things, I may like you to summarize this second chapter for our viewers.
Yeah, summarizing it, as the title of the chapter says, that Iqbal is firmly, is convinced, is a firm believer in the idea that the religious experience is a valid experience. And he says that the religious experience can pass the philosophical test. It need not be scared of philosophical scrutiny. And then the way he explains the problems which are inherent in our understanding, our exclusively or merely intellectual understanding of God. So he wants to, that's something that he will follow up in his third chapter, in his third lecture, because third lecture will talk about the conception of God and the meaning of prayer. Their prayer, according to Iqbal, would be the way that humans can directly experience God. So summing up this lecture, he thinks that modern science has actually challenge some of the fundamental ideas which were there for a long time and which were seen as direct challenges to religion, which were seen as a direct challenge to a spiritual interpretation of the universe. Science has moved towards a direction where we can now interpret universe in a more spiritual and religious way. Secondly, this is first. Secondly, Iqbal thinks that modern philosophers like Whitehead, Bergson, and some other philosophers have also shown us the way that psychology and other sciences can allow us to look at religious experience in a way that actually prove the validity of religious experience. And finally, he comes to this idea that, or taking all these things together, there is no need for a religious person who is also philosophically oriented to be somehow uncertain or to be not confident about the fundamentals of his faith. So rational scrutiny of religion is not something that we should be scared of or we should run away from. This is something that no intelligent person can avoid, because at one point or the other, you will ask yourself these questions. And Iqbal shows his confidence here that yes, we can take up the challenge and we can face this challenge successfully.
Thank you very much. And I am very hopeful that you will be actually enjoying and learning something out of these two podcasts which we have recorded. And inshallah, we'll see you soon in the third podcast. Thank you very much.